group clues, not for the webinar. We're just going to kind of go through the questions. So the first question is, how do the articles define whiteness and white supremacy? Gosh. I guess I'll start. I took some little notes. So one of our first articles said that whiteness is socially constructed emphasis on white culture and histories. So that's whiteness itself. And then white supremacy, the difference is that it's institutionalized processes that emphasize white people at the expense of people of color. So there's a little bit of a difference between just whiteness and then white supremacy, because white supremacy has to have like the, I don't know, the institution, the process behind it.
One of the ways that distinction showed up a lot was that whiteness is very identity-based, but it's more flexible in meaning. So there's a lot of emphasis on like having to reckon with your whiteness, or having to like over like those 6 stages of white identity, like that is a constant of like whether or not you're dealing with parts of the racism there, that whiteness you attach and reattach and dissociate and come to terms with it at the end kind of deal. So you've got that as sort of an identity block that you are in relation to in different ways through that process.
Yeah, and going after that, Laura, with you said it was flexible. I think it was in the article, D'Angelo said that she like defined it in like 3 different ways. She said like whiteness is a location of structural advantage. It's a standpoint from which white people look at themselves and others, and it's like a set of cultural practices. So again, that like it's a little more fluid in how it's used. Where white supremacy is a little more like, this is what it is. That's kind of more set in stone.
Yeah. And I thought one of the other interesting parts of that was that it gets put as the basis against which everything else is compared, and we see that a lot. And I know a lot of the like whatever race talks we've had in other classes or growing up, like that white is a race, but then this idea of like whiteness, and I found it interesting that some of the articles capitalize that with like a capital W, like that when we don't recognize white as a race, then everything else, no matter what it is, no subtlety acknowledged at all, everything else becomes against normal. So I liked that specifying. That was interesting.
Yeah. I was looking at the article by D'Angelo on that white fragility, and the quote that she talks about says that Frankenberg defines whiteness as something that's very multidimensional. Like, we're talking, it's got several different layers, and I agree with the thing that the race privilege, and maybe even I agree with it, like at a standpoint from where we look at ourselves as a society. The part where it says whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. I think that's too broad, from my personal opinion, because that to me is, I'm not even quite sure how to put it. That to me is saying that, just like if I were to say that all black people are alike or all Asians are alike, that's saying that all white people have the same culture. Whether you are pure white, which none of us are, or you are a mixed culture, which I am like a mixed culture. I look like a white woman, but I am half Mexican, So you've got that disconnect, if you will. It makes me feel like it's saying that all white people are the same, and I wouldn't say that about black people or Asian people or Mexican people or anything else. Nobody is all the same, and that's one of the things that I think has bothered me a lot with this reading, is it's lumping everyone together as the same, and that's just my opinion.
I find that some of the definitions of whiteness do back to to what Laura said, though, the fact that there's many levels, especially the article where she talked about the different they talk about the different types, and I feel
Helms.
like I
Janet
like
Helms.
that a lot better because there are different types. There are, like, even in my family alone, I have people that are more towards the racist views, and then others like me, I don't view myself that way. So I feel like I like that one where it brought up the different levels where it's down. But I do agree with some of the definitions of whiteness kind of threw me off because I was like, that doesn't represent me in my view. But then I have to go back to how what she said is very flexible.
That's true. It's in that video, the first video. Let me grab my notes.
That's the Helms one again too.
Yes, by Dr. Helms, talking about the different levels. Yes, that was, and as I was reading that and reading the article as well, I was trying to kind of place myself in a level, if you will. Yeah. And it's very flexible, and I think it probably, at least for me, it seems to kind of change or float a little bit.
I like the spiral staircase thing.
They mentioned that too. I can't remember where it was, but someone said it wasn't like a linear process. It was more cyclic, where like certain, it's like in various aspects you could be at once believed.
I think that may have been in the Ladson Billing.
Maybe. Because they talked about the analogy of the spiral staircase where you see a point and then you come back around. So, like, right now I'm feeling like immersion, but wait, I just came across this interaction and something about that hit something in me and I'm like, oh, where'd that come from? And now I'm looking over the side of that staircase and going, oh, hello. Like, yeah. And I kind of wonder if the, like, whiteness as representing all white people is part of that, as we're seeing different stages of that within ourselves. Because, like, privilege itself is a culture. Like, so if we're looking at, like, whiteness as an overall culture, like, yeah, there's subtleties, but there's subtleties within any culture. But privilege carries its own culture, and, like, I've lived other countries too, and, like, that was one of the more disturbing things about living some places I have, like, how explicit, like, they called it white lady privilege. They said, like, and it was, like, very explicit, like, you have to follow the rules with this, and, like, there is a separate culture that goes with a place of privilege because you operate differently under that.
Yes. Yeah, one thing I actually really liked about this module was that whenever I first started reading about all the white privilege, what whiteness is, white supremacy, and things, I was a little bit confused. But then as I read everything, it all connected so much and showed just how complex everything was. Especially the white racial identity development stages, and you can like go all around the different ones, and then that connected to the white fragility that was talked about. Like, everything had all of these layers, but I felt like all of it was true. Like, I completely, all of those layers, different steps that were talked about in the document.
Yeah, I'm just gonna mute for a minute so y'all don't have to listen to Cody.
And then we brought it up a little bit. The white fragility was a really big.
Sorry, y'all. That was.
And I really liked that. I was kind of like Whitney and Casey a little bit. I don't want to that's like a little defensive when I first heard the term, like fragility, like fragile. But I think it was in the second video even. She explicitly says that she doesn't mean the term in a negative way. Like, it just like she goes, I'm not saying that white people are fragile, but basically just saying that because we become so comfortable with being the dominant place for a lot of things, that when those issues are brought up, it just makes us uncomfortable and we are unable to deal with that scenario. So again, I kind of was like a little hesitant at first about the term and what exactly she was trying to say, but then like Casey, as I kept reading, like watching the videos and stuff, it all kind of made sense. So just maybe want to hear your guys' thoughts on the white fragility and how that can impact maybe the classroom setting.
This is a thing my friends and I talk about a lot, actually. The group I grew up with is fairly racially diverse, and this is one of the things that we saw there was like this kind of like dominant group of really evangelical white kids that would not leave us alone. If you weren't in like it was like a religious stration in this school, and as the students of color had that really hard, and as we worked through some of like the like human geography stuff or whatever in school, and these kids would just lose their cookies over everything, and like the girl, like the second to last article or the last article, the girl screaming, I'm not around, like every day, all the time. And so this was one of the ways that they kind of helped us sort through that as a school, is like, hey, you haven't learned how to have conversations yet, and that's what is happening. And so I was like analogizing, that's not a word, to making up words. Becca and I both teach high school math, and one of the things we've talked about a lot is like the kids that don't know how to struggle. They if it's not as easy as adding, they're not going to do it. They don't know how to struggle. They lose. It's like they flip their biscuits. Okay, well that's what as white people we're experiencing if we haven't had these conversations, and if we don't know people of color, and if we don't have the language and the stamina, like the word stamina in that article, like the stamina to have these discussions. Well, if you haven't had any background in that and you see it as a threat, like it makes it a little easier to understand as people freak out like that. But it's still hard for me to imagine people like outbursting to that level. Really?
As I was reading about it, I kept connecting it to the disintegration stage in the identity development, which was the second one, that once you're confronted with something and you're grappling with it and trying to figure it out, it seemed like with the people who just freaked out in this article and just couldn't handle the things they were being told, so that they were confronted with something and they didn't understand what options they had of where to go. So instead of accepting it and asking for more information and taking it in, instead they said, well, that doesn't match what I know, so you're wrong and you're making this up and it's not true, and all this stuff. So it's like, I just kept going back to these stages through everything that we read. It's like people can't get past that second stage. They can't listen to people and they say, well, I'm not racist, so this doesn't make sense to me, so you're obviously lying, or this isn't true because this isn't what I know as a white person.
Like that story about the person who went in to the professor's office to contest a grade and was like, oh, well, it's not legitimately done, or going through like 15 different excuses, none of which held water. Like couldn't actually come out and say, I'm not listening to a black female professor. Mm-hmm. Went through 18, I can't remember how many examples there were, but just like the lengths to which they would go to when they couldn't reckon with what they couldn't handle.
Right. Yes.
What do you think of Thaddius? Do we have audio?
I'm at my computer right now.
Okay.
Oh, good.
All right, so now that we defined so many of the terms in kind of part one, part two, we're going to focus more on how we can use that in the classroom. So kind of those questions about how do we address whiteness and white identity development in our own classrooms. So take it away.
So
Okay.
for me, classroom is predominantly
Breaking up for me.
Same.
Thaddius, we heard you start, but we haven't heard pass. You want to try again?
with my I'm a middle school math teacher.
There we go.
So my class is predominantly African American and Hispanic. We don't have any whites as far as students, but we do have teachers. And one of the things that I think as far as teachers, we don't have time to get together and discuss type issues as far as how teachers present information in the classroom, as far as how teachers how to give information lacking to these Latino kids. So I think one of the things as educators, what we need to do, that we need to come together and to discuss the race issue that goes on within the school, so outside of the school setting. And so I think starting with the teachers, first of all, will be a great move as far as discussing race. And
So you said outside of the school setting, what do you think would be an effective way to do that?
I don't know if anybody would like to ask something, because I don't know if classrooms are diverse or whatever, or their staff. I think this began to establish relationships, seeing what goes on outside of the kids' setting, in their community, finding out what they're doing, their community. With them, I think that's a good start.
Absolutely. Now,
Because a lot of times kids just knows what goes on outside them, see their struggles, what they're going through, and seeing and witnessing that would help out a lot as well. So I think a lot of times kids want you to relate to their situations.
And I'm a different setting. I'm an elementary setting.
I have not worked in a school setting where the students are predominantly white. I can't relate. But I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I think it's just your computer does the intervals, and so I don't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
go ahead, Ansley. I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're probably forward.
So currently I have.
Go ahead.
Okay, currently I live in Kuwait, so I do have a lot of diversity nationality-wise. But going back to my school setting in America, it was predominantly white. I would have maybe one African-American student in my elementary setting, then two or three. For me to bring up these issues, I feel like at the elementary level, it gets a little tricky because you don't want to, you have to watch their parents too, and they don't want you to feel like you're teaching them when it comes to race, because you know it can get really tricky. So for me, I use a lot of picture books, and I use about different cultures and things. And then I would, if I want to talk about a certain thing, I would put it on them and give them, well, how would you feel if you walked in and people made fun of you, or whatever the situation, the race issue was. I would put it as experience first, and then we would read the picture book that had it, and we would talk about it that way. So I try to do it more subtly than just bringing up, so I would do it through picture books and experiences and make them think, imagine if this happened to you. Even in my setting now in Kuwait, when I do the different cultures, I do the same thing. And I also try to connect it. Have you ever felt like this if the character is done the same way? So I try to do it that way instead of just blatantly in their face having a race conversation.
And I think that's really important, the difference between like younger kids versus older kids. Like in the high school setting, a lot of times it is a little bit more like the situations arise and they're like in your face. And the one thing I found really powerful from the readings and the videos and stuff was the fact that staying silent as a teacher is reinforcing white supremacy. So a lot of times, I know personally it's not the best, but when something comes up, it's like, all right, let's go back to math. Let's just refocus. And I never realized how that could be perceived by students. Like I thought, like, well, we're just not going to talk about it. Like it's not the place, but really it is the place. And with the high school kids, sometimes you do just have to pause and say, okay, we're going to talk about this. Like, but that quote, I think it was D'Angelo who said that being silent is almost just as powerful as openly stating your views.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That was the biggest thing that changed in my teaching last year. I went from, like where we taught was, it had some diversity, but it was a lot wider than I grew up with, at least.
Yeah.
And then I moved and was in. We had some white kids at my last school, and the one I'm going to this year, there's a handful, and it was just so much more normal to be able to talk about it when things came up. Because especially in high school, they have interesting ideas, and some of them are coming in with some kind of scary ideas too about their peers, and it was a lot easier in a more diverse school to just talk about it. We're like, okay, we need to just break down what happened here because this does not fly in this room. And I think I wonder how much of it is that those kids do have stamina for racial discussion. If we go back to the D'Angelo white fragility stuff, they're used to dealing with it. It is part of their lives. Those issues come up regularly. They have the vocabulary. They have the stamina to talk through.
In elementary, they don't, because a lot of times when you bring up those issues, you then get the kids, well, my mom said this, and then the other people, my dad. So then now you're conflicting with their parents' views, and then their kids, they go back home and talk to their parents. So there's like a fine line. And it's interesting what y'all are talking about, because in mine, I've always been told try to be unbiased and not give yours. So I've always been told to be silent, because when you give your views, that's when conflict with parents and stuff comes. So it's really interesting how it contradicts, but I've always been told.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially like I'm thinking about my high school students whenever we're learning about this, but I think it is really important to talk about whiteness and how whiteness has created normal and the status quo, because if you don't talk about that, especially in an all-white class, once you do start talking about race and bringing up historical figures or people who aren't white, then it totally creates like an us versus them scenario where they can't connect themselves to what they're learning because they don't see where they fit into the picture, because they don't see that whiteness kind of is a culture of its own. They don't see that.
Yeah, and even like I feel like the younger kids are.
We got you, Thaddius. Go ahead.
Oh, one of the things I wanted to add is the trauma issue.
Yeah.
I know with my students, I have middle school and I relate to a lot of the high school students. And one of the things that I found out with a lot of my students is trauma. I used to ask the question at the beginning of the year, how many of your family members have died to gun violence? Probably 90% of the class. If you're incarcerated, it will be 90% of the class. How many come from foster care? These questions might be personal, so first I establish the expectation. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. So they are free to. They want to see somebody that cares about them, and so a lot of these kids are going through trauma in my class. Are concerned and how we treat kids, and sometimes how our anger as far as towards the kids, we have to be careful, because a lot of these kids are going to family members. Some family members have died gun violence. I suppose with films, like the trauma that the black kids go through, see. Doesn't have to be indirect. Most of these kids have seen it directly. Trauma they've gone through is very critical in the classroom. So I just wanted to add that, because I know I've experienced that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, in my situation, I'm in a pretty rural area, and I'd say 85% of our kids are white. My kids are white. the rest are Hispanic. I think there are, I hate to say this, but there are I can think of 2 black kids in my school. It's just the area that we live in. But the trauma, I think we need to help our kids to understand that the trauma goes across races. I know that at least 50% of my students have got parents or that are incarcerated and they're living with their grandparents. There's a lot of drug problem in our area. And we need to find a way to help our kids to understand that type of trauma, whether it be gun violence or drugs or incarceration, or in my case, poverty is a big problem in our area. We need to find a way to help our kids to understand that crosses those cultural boundaries, those racial boundaries. You know, it's not just the white kids in my school. It's not just the Hispanic kids in my school that are having these issues. It's all of our kids.
Maybe that's an end to talk about racial trauma too. If we look at that as sort of a universal human experience, like, look, everyone here is coming in with something, and some of you are coming in with some very heavy stuff. Like, I think it's important to recognize the racial trauma, especially if, like, we read about, microaggressions and about macroaggressions too.
Things like Trayvon Martin and that was hard that video was hard to watch.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
that Dr. Helms had, that was tough.
And like, it talked about different types of trauma. I'm trying to remember which article. I should look at my notes now. But where there's different types of trauma that go along with racial violence, and like, there's direct trauma to you, and then there's the trauma of being part of a targeted group, and then there's if we can connect that, because so many of these kids can relate to trauma in some way or another. The white kids, the Hispanic kids, like everybody. If it's not them, they know someone. By the time they get to middle school with Thaddius or to high school with us, but most elementary school kids know someone who's experienced something horrible, unfortunately.
As kind of keeping an eye on time, unfortunately, with a group of 6 people, it's kind of hard to talk through everything. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I think if people still want to talk through stuff, like, we can hang out for a while, but for the recording, I'm going to go ahead and cut us off if everyone's okay.
Okay.
Great.